Hello, I'm Cassandra, and this is my Fantasy-A-Thon Wrap Up. Fantasy-A-Thon ran between the 5th and the 15th of April, and I decided pretty much as soon as they announced it that I was going to participate. I also participated in the Owls Magical Readathon, and that started before Fantasy-A-Thon, but Fantasy-A-Thon was technically the first readathon that I participated in. Also because Fantasy-A-Thon, of course, ended before the Owls Magical Readathon, so I finished it before the Owls. So Fantasy-A-Thon had 7 challenges, and you could combine them however much you liked, and I ended up reading 3 books. Now, originally decided I would only read 2 books, but I ended up completing both books ahead of time, so I squeezed in a 3rd one and then swapped out some of the challenges. So let's talk about the books, and let me talk about them in order of the challenges. So let's go through the challenges first, and then I'll tell you which book I used to complete which challenge. So the first challenge is to read a diverse fantasy, and for that one I read The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. It has both a female-female relationship and a male-male relationship, and they are done, in my opinion, quite well. I can't really speak for it, I'm straight myself, but as far as I could see, it was quite good representation. The second challenge was to read a debut or backlist fantasy, and for that one I read Freshwater by Akwaeke Emesi. This is the book that I didn't think I was gonna end up reading, so this one was the one that I sort of squeezed in at the last minute. It's quite short. It is categorized as fantasy at my library, and that's why I ended up reading it. I was planning on reading it anyway because it's on the Women's Prize for Fiction longlist, but I wouldn't necessarily categorize it as fantasy. The third challenge is to start a new series or continue on in a series, and for that one I read The Masked City by Genevieve Cogman. This is the second book in the Invisible Library series. I owned the first book and I was unsure. I'm trying to complete all my started series on my shelves. So I borrowed this from the library and I tried to see if I was interested in continuing on with the series, and it ended up with me feeling like I don't want to continue on with this. But more about that later. The fourth challenge is to read a hype train fantasy, and for that one I read Priory of the Orange Tree. It is one of the most hyped fantasies. I feel like everybody who wanted to read it read it in either March or April. The fifth challenge is to read a book that you set aside to give that a second chance. I sort of stretched the interpretation of that one because I had read the first book in this series I think maybe 4 years ago, and I decided to pick up the next one, like I said, to see if I wanted to continue on with the series and finish the series. So this is a book that I technically put aside, and it is a book that I perhaps also gave a second chance in that I liked the first book, but I thought when I read the first book I thought it was going to be a standalone, and it wasn't. So I wasn't intrigued to immediately pick up the next one. So maybe I gave this a second chance, and that I gave it a chance to change my opinion about the series. The sixth challenge is to read a fantasy in a age range or a format that you don't usually read from. And again, I sort of stretched the interpretation. I have read quite a few young adult fantasies, but I have recently realized that I am quite picky with my young adult fantasy. It requires it to be especially good for me to enjoy it. So this is a young adult fantasy, and so I decided that that would sort of suit the gist of the challenge at least. The seventh challenge is to immerse yourself in self-care while you read. The host of the challenge explained it as eating some of your favorite snacks, or maybe shutting yourself off from any distractions while you read, or perhaps take a bath. And I don't usually read in the bath, so I decided to give that a chance. So I read both Priory of the Orange Tree and Freshwater in the bath. But I would say I mainly read Freshwater because I realized quite quickly that Priory of the Orange Tree is a bit too heavy, and I was sort of right at the end, so I couldn't evenly distribute the weight of the book on both hands. It was very much only in my left hand. So I mainly read Freshwater. It's thinner, it's easier to read, and I did enjoy myself quite a lot with that challenge. It made me actually continue. So throughout the month of April I have read a few other books also in the bath. Now let's get to the actual reviews of these books. And let's start with the book that I finished first, and that is The Masked City. The Invisible Library is a series that revolves around Irene, who is a librarian for the library, and the library is a sort of, I would say interdimensional, but like it's a library that sort of exists outside of time and space, and then from this library you can travel to other dimensions, and these other dimensions or other worlds are constructed differently, and mainly they differ in how much they are infected by chaos, which comes from the Fey world, or how much they are constructed from order, which comes from the dragon world. It is quite a cool concept. Irene, sort of, her work is that she investigates when someone is trying to steal literature. So she collects important literature from these different worlds. So she could, for instance, collect different versions of the same book, or she could collect a book that only exists in one world. She could collect it for safekeeping. And then she is helped by her assistant Kai, who is a lower level dragon. It's a cool concept. It is interesting. I quite like the main character. She's sort of a go-getter. She is also quite strict in following the rules, which is interesting. She's not just some like rogue player in this game. She's quite bound by her rules and by her responsibilities as a librarian. She also has like a power, which is that she can use the language, which allows her to affect both animate and inanimate objects around her. So for example, she tries to be as specific as possible, and she could sort of go, the weapon in the hands of my sister backfire, and then that weapon in particular will backfire. And that takes a lot out of her. It's an interesting skill, but I felt like it wasn't constrained enough. Overall, I feel like this book has the same problems as a lot of young adult fantasy, which is the kind of problems that makes me not as interested to read YA fantasy, which is that things are a bit too convenient and things are a bit too simplistic. You don't put as much limitations on certain things. For instance, she is restricted in her use of the language once by them covering her mouth, but that happens like once, and I feel like there should be more restrictions, because that power, they're overpowered. Like there's no restriction to a power like that, like using the language. There are also other things that are very, very interesting. Like I think that there's a lot of really interesting ideas in this book, but that I don't actually like the execution of those, because it is a young adult fantasy. In a adult fantasy, I feel like they could have spent more time developing the world. And I know I'm being broad and being very general, but it's just the pattern of what I've felt from young adult fantasy. So, like I mentioned, like I foreshadowed, I won't continue on with the series, and I have unhauled the first book in the series, which I owned, because I just decided that this wasn't for me. So in that sense, it was a success, me reading this, because I realized that I don't want to continue reading it. The second book that I finished is Freshwater, and it was amazing. I had very low expectations going in, Like I mentioned, it's from the Women's Prize for Fiction long list. It's about a girl who is born in Africa, and when she's born, the gates from the world before she was born, sort of the spiritual plane, isn't properly shut. So she has spirits inside of her. And those spirits are, when she's little, they are also little and not quite as developed, but they affect her quite a lot. They talk a lot about, because it's from mainly the perspective of these spirits, and they talk in a we form, like we were inside the body of the Ada, which is the child. And then the child grows up, and she struggles a lot with that, and the spirits are not strictly good or strictly evil. They talk a lot about how they exploit the Ada, and how they want to protect her. They wish her well, but at the same time they have their own interest in what they want to do, and they push the Ada to do that. These spirits are sort of just going around her in her body as she's growing up, and then when she becomes an adult, there are certain events that happen to her which awaken them. And then in the end, they sort of crystallized into 3 different spirits. And one of these spirits is a man who is interested in women. And the main spirits, the we, are interested in men and are quite feminine. And the author themselves is a non-binary person. So the story of these different spirits and these different spirits trying to affect her and having their own agenda becomes a sort of an exploration of trans people, I felt, and also an exploration of non-binariness and what that is and how that is made up. I felt it was very difficult to understand. I ended up giving it a 4-star because it took me quite a long time to get into it, to understand what it was I was reading, and there's a lot of things that are left up to interpretation, and I felt that was so difficult. But at the same time, I really loved the book because it gave me so much room to have my own interpretation, and it also made me feel so clever when I figured out, like, oh, because it was going on about these different spirits and how they had, you know, their different agendas and how they were at war with themselves and at war with the Ada. And then I was like, oh, but if I interpret this as transness or as non-binariness, then this all of a sudden makes a lot of sense. And I felt like I was so broken out of my own shell, of my own, you know, view of the world, and how locked in I am into this sort of binary cis way of thinking. Yeah, it was just really great. I wish I had someone who had read it also, who I could talk about it with, because I feel like I would have understood it more if I could talk to someone about it. So yeah, it's really good. You should read it. I really recommend it. Last but definitely not least is The Priory of the Orange Tree. Like I said, I feel a lot of people have read this. I have heard some negative response. I was watching Murphy Napier reading it, and she was complaining about the writing style, and I sort of agree with her. She felt like the writing was very odd, like they were giving very odd descriptions of things to do a sort of shorthand, or I think my interpretation of it was that the weird descriptions provided a shorthand so that Samantha Shannon didn't have to go on and on and on about describing the world and describing the people, because she didn't have a lot of space to do that. And my main complaint is that she did not have enough space to fully explore all the different towns and all the different parts of the world and all the different characters. I felt like this book could have done a lot better if it was more than one book. With that said, one of the reasons why I picked it up is because it is a standalone. I was very happy with the fact that this is one contained story. I didn't have to read on in a series because, like I mentioned, I'm trying to finish my series, so I didn't want to pick up another series before I finish those. But I felt like it was, at the end of the day, this book provided too big of an undertaking for the 800 pages. Is it 800 or 850? Yeah, it's 800 pages. I feel like she could have done more with this huge world, with this sort of huge cast of characters. 800 pages of fantasy, I would have preferred if it followed only, because it follows both the East and the West. And I think that if she had concentrated on only the West or only the East, 800 pages would have been a perfect amount of pages for all of that. For the amount of stuff she tried to put in here, I think she should have written a whole series. And I'm not trying to complain about the book because it was really good. I really liked the cast of characters, I really liked the whole world, but I felt like things were going so quickly. And there was a lot, and this is very, very apt criticism, is people who are complaining about how convenient things are. Because by the end of the book, I was like, oh wow, they don't have a lot of pages to wrap this up, and now they are introducing, or they're not introducing, they are sort of encountering a conflict that has been talked about in the beginning of the book. And then that was resolved like immediately. Like they were just, the other party was just like, oh, I'm on board. No questions asked, let's just do it. And I was just like, that's not how it would happen. And it's just annoying, and it's so apparent that you don't have enough space or pages to really have that conflict, which could have been a really good conflict. It could have been, it was a really good conflict, but it wasn't a conflict. Yeah, so I think she should have done a lesser undertaking if you want to write a standalone fantasy. With that said, it was really easy to read, it was really smooth, I really liked all the characters. I can understand why people are preferring the East characters to the West, and I do agree with the criticism that the East got a lot less space in the book than the West characters. I would have preferred if they were given about equal space. Yeah, I have a lot of criticisms, but I also really, really liked it. I gave it a 4-star because I really liked it. It was a really solid book. So that was my Fantasy-A-Thon wrap up. The hosts were talking about if they wanted to do it again, and they said they would definitely do it again. And I am definitely on board to do the readathon again. I really like fantasy, and I have more fantasies on my shelf that I'm dying to read, so bring it on, that's what I say. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you've read any of these, please feel free to talk about them down below. I would love to hear your opinions on it. I know that a lot of people really liked the Priory of the Orange Tree. If you could see the same things that I was seeing in it, please talk about that down below. I'd be interested to see if I was alone in my thoughts. If you could understand any of my thoughts, really. Yeah. And also if you've read Freshwater, please talk about your interpretation of it. Thank you very much. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.